Hi guys, welcome back to the Plug Econ&Math, your go-to channel for simple and clear breakdowns of economics and mathematics. Today we will look at the NSC Paper 1. We will go through the economic concepts section step by step using past question papers. First, we will look at November 2023 and then November 2024. So the instruction is to give one term for each of the following descriptions. Now take note that no abbreviations, acronyms, or examples will be accepted. 1.3.1, which states that the withdrawal of money from the circular flow. Now reflecting back, we have leakages and injections. Now, withdrawal of money from the circular flow means that money is going out because it's a withdrawal. So we say that this is a leakage. Examples include savings, taxes, and imports. But on the other hand, additions of money into the circular flow, this means that money is coming in and being added because it says additions. So we say that this is an injection. Examples include government spending, investments, and exports. But our statement says withdrawal of money from the circular flow. Withdrawal, so it's a leakage. 1.3.2 states that a summary of various indicators of the same type into a single value. Well, in your textbook, this is found under economic indicators used in forecasting under your business cycle section. So in this case, it's a summary of various indicators of the same type into a single value. This is a single value that forms the norms for a country's economic performance. For example, we have the Human Development Index, the HDI. HDI, for example, is a summary measure of average achievement in health, education, and income. So you see, a summary of various indicators into a single value. Therefore, we call this a composite indicator. 1.3.3 states that the exchange rate is determined by market forces with intervention by the central bank. So let's break it down. We have an exchange rate system. Here it's where every country manages the value of its currency by determining the exchange rate system that will apply to its currency, which is why there's numerous exchange rate systems. Number 1, we have the free floating exchange rate. This is the value of the exchange rate, which is determined purely by the market forces of demand and supply with no interference from the central bank. Number 2 is the fixed exchange rate, which is a system where the exchange rate is fixed by the central bank in the country. Then we have number 3, which is the managed floating exchange rate. This system combines elements of both the floating and fixed exchange rate. The managed floating exchange rate is determined by the market forces of demand and supply with interference from the central bank to a certain degree. Coming back to a statement that says the exchange rate is determined by market forces with intervention by the central bank. Keywords, market forces with intervention. So it's the managed floating exchange rate. 1.3.4 says the increase in the capacity of the economy to produce more goods and services. We say it's economic growth. Well, why? It's because economic growth is commonly measured as an increase in the level of production of goods and services in an economy from one period to another. Therefore, looking at our statement which says an increase in the capacity of the economy to produce more goods and services, so we say it's economic growth. 1.3.5, which states that it's the processing of natural resources into finished products. So remember that in an economy, the natural resources follow a certain process. So we have number 1, the extraction of natural resources, which is commonly known as the extraction process. Secondly, it's the processing of natural resources which are transformed into usable products, which is known as the processing and manufacturing process. Then the products are packaged and shipped to shops, warehouses, or consumers. This process is known as the distribution and transportation process. Lastly, we get people who buy and use the products, and this is the consumption and usage process. But yet again, remember, we have the three sectors of an economy: the primary sector, which deals directly with natural resources. These activities include farming, mining, and so forth. Then it's the secondary sector that takes the raw materials from the primary sector and processes or manufactures them into finished goods. It includes factories, constructions, and production industries. Lastly, it's the tertiary sector that provides services rather than goods. It includes education, healthcare, retail, and other service based industries. So, in our case, that statement says the processing of natural resources into finished products. Therefore, we say that this is the manufacturing process, and yet again, it's the secondary sector. Lastly, we have 1.3.6, which states that it is the lowest interest rate charged by commercial banks to their best clients. Well, we say that this is the prime rate. Remember, the prime rate is the foundational interest rate that banks use to determine how much interest they will charge on loans to their best and most creditworthy customers. This is the main interest rate that banks use to decide the interest rates for different kinds of loans, like your home loans and personal loans. Well, I know that we may say maybe, just maybe, it's the repo rate. We have to remember that the repo rate is the interest rate at which central banks use to lend money to commercial banks for a short period of time. But in this case, it's the interest rate charged by commercial banks to their customers or clients, which is why we say it's the prime rate. And now we look at the November 2024 question paper. 1.3.1, which says the flow of goods, services, and factors of production among the participants of the economy. We have the real flow and the money flow. Now, looking at the flow of income and expenditure between the participants in the circular flow or economy, this is referred to as the money flow. Then, the flow of goods and services between the participants in the circular flow or economy, and now we say that this is the real flow. But our statement says the flow of goods, services, and factors of production among the participants in the economy. So it's the flow of goods, services, and factors of production, meaning it's the real flow. 1.3.2, which says a curve that illustrates the inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Now, this links back to the Phillips curve. It shows the relationship between inflation, which is the rise in prices, and unemployment. Now, look at this. When the unemployment rate is low, more people have jobs. They tend to spend more money, and businesses raise their prices, which is higher inflation. But on the other hand, when unemployment is higher, fewer people spend money, so prices rise slowly, or they may even fall, which is lower inflation. So, as our statement says, a curve that illustrates the inverse relationship between unemployment and the inflation rate, which is the Phillips curve. 1.3.3 says the transfer of functions and ownership of entities from the private sector to the public sector. So remember, public to private, private to public. So we have privatization and nationalization. Firstly, the transfer of functions and ownership from the public sector to the private sector, we say this is privatization. Then secondly, it's the transfer of functions and ownership from the private sector to the public sector, and this we call nationalization. And now our statement says the transfer of functions and ownership from the private to the public sector. So private to public, it's nationalization. 1.3.4 now says the financial support in the form of cash payments provided by the government to domestic producers. Now let's go back. We have subsidies. These include direct and indirect subsidies. Direct subsidies refers to the financial support provided by the government to domestic producers who export goods. It takes place in the form of cash payments to exporters. Then we have the indirect subsidies, which refers to the support provided by the government that does not hold a predetermined monetary value or involve actual cash outlays, but it takes place in the form of refunds on import tariffs and general tax rebates. So now the statement says financial support in the form of cash payments provided by the government to domestic producers. Cash payments, which is why we say it's direct subsidies. 1.3.5, which says industries that employ more labor than capital in the production process. Now, this links back to when we have certain industries, such as the farming industry, where the production process usually uses more people than it actually uses machines. For example, growing crops by hands, which is formerly known as labor intensivity, while using tractors, on the other hand, and harvesters is known as the capital intensive. But our statement says industries that employ more labor than capital in the production process. Keyword, more labor than capital, which is why we say it is labor intensive. Lastly, we have 1.3.6, which says the economic indicator used to measure the cost of living. But now remember, we have Producer Price Index, also known as the PPI, and Consumer Price Index, also known as the CPI. So note, Consumer Price Index pertains to cost of living. The basket consists of consumer goods and services, and the prices include value added tax, VAT. And we also have the Producer Price Index, which pertains the cost of production. The basket consists of goods only, with the prices excluding the value added tax. And our statement says the economic indicator used to measure the cost of living. So keyword, measure cost of living, which is why we say it's the Consumer Price Index. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you on the next video.